In this lecture, we'll talk about, we'll complete talking about a server, it's a generic server, and then we'll talk about how to make it a live server, basically a server you want it to stay alive, to continue to do its job over time. So we'll talk about that. Sending and receiving. So in our generic server, its job is basically to wait for connections. When it gets one, it accepts it. It accepts whatever data comes in on the socket. Then it takes that and just turns it around. It sends it back. Okay, this is a really simple, what we'll call an echo server. Really simple, just receives the message, then sends the same thing right back to the client. So it's a dumb server, but you could imagine putting in something more interesting if you wanted to. That does something, receives the data, processes it, and sends a result back. That would be easy, but we're just doing the generic thing. So we start off over at the right here. You start doing the receive. So you have a connection at this point, and you say con is your connection, con.receive. That receives the data that you want to receive. And 1000, the argument to receive, is the maximum amount of bytes that we want to receive. We limit it so that we don't overflow any buffers. This shouldn't be a problem in Python, but in a language like C, that could be an issue. So we do the receive, and the information goes into data. Then we just turn it right around. We say con.sendAll data. So we send the data right back. So receive is used to receive the data. SendAll sends it. We didn't use send, we use sendAll just because, as we said before, sendAll actually makes sure that the message is sent, that all the data is sent, even if there are issues or it's chopped up into chunks or something like that, it all gets sent. So we use sendAll. And at the end, after you're done with sending the data back, the server's done its job, so we say, okay, now we can close the connection and close the socket, and you do them in that order. So that's sort of a simple generic server right there. That's the end of it anyway. But typically you want a live server. So a live server is a server that doesn't just receive one message, send this response back, do that once, and then go to sleep, and end, right? We don't want that usually. Usually a server is a program that stays alive for a long period of time waiting for messages. And it receives a message, it does something, it sends a response. It waits for the next one, it continues. In fact, it generally continues forever. So here's how we've modified the code slightly to do that. Basically, it's similar to what we just saw, except you'll notice this while true loop, right? So that's a while true, that's an infinite loop, because true is always true. So what it does is inside the loop, it accepts a connection. So it's waiting for a connection, it accepts one when one comes in. It returns the connection and the address. So the address, we don't actually need the address right now, but the connection is key. Then we call receive on that connection to receive the data on that connection. Then if not data, we break. So the idea there is that if we don't receive any data on the connection, then we know the communication is done and we can just break out of this whole loop. But if there is data, then you say con sendAll data. You just do what we want to do, send the response back. Presumably, if it were a more interesting server, it would do processing first, then send the result back. But we send the data back, and then we go back into the loop, waiting to accept the next connection. So, or not the next connection, but waiting to accept the next message. And then outside of the loop, we close the connection and we close the socket. So that's just an example of a live server, how you make it so that it stays alive over a period of time. And this is much more typical of a server. Infinite loop, and the connection is closed when no data is received. So full server program. So this is just the whole program put together from top to bottom over all the slides. You start off, you import, don't mind the indentation. The indentation of the two imports is shifted by one, but unindent that. That should be all the way left justified. So you import the socket and sys. Socket you import because that has a socket library in it. Import sys because sys allows us to do sys.exit, which means when there's an error, remember we need this for error handling, right? When there's some error, we print out our error message and then we're going to exit. Okay, we don't want to continue doing anything else because there's been a failure. So we put sys in there just so we have that exit function. And it starts off, we create the socket, so mysock equals socket.socket and so on. Create a socket. Then inside the first try, we do a bind. We bind to that socket. The first argument is empty, right? Because we don't know what IP address we're going to bind to. It depends on who's trying to connect with us. 1, 2, 3, 4 is just an arbitrary port number, but the second argument is port number. So we bind to the socket. Then we listen on that socket, mysock.listen. We listen on the socket waiting for a message to come in. Then we go into our loop that we just saw. When a message comes in, we accept it, returning the connection. We receive data from that connection. Then if there's some data, if there is some data, we go and send response back. Otherwise, we break because we know we're done. And we stay in that loop until there is no data that's received. So we receive data and data is empty. Then we break out of that. We close the connection and close the socket. Thank you.